Welcome to lecture number 2, Government and Power. This is a continuation of our flipped classroom. Please make sure you have your notebooks with you and that you're taking notes along with what we're talking about. It may also be helpful to have your textbook with you alongside this. This material can be found in a little bit greater depth in Chapter 1. We won't spend too terribly much time on this material since it's pretty straightforward and basic. And if there are questions, please go to the book and we'll cover these in class when we go over this material a little bit more specifically. But we pick up on the second lecture, which we talked about philosophies of government and the social contract theory. And now we need to understand, what does this government begin to look like? What does our government begin to look like in the face of new challenges, in the face of independence, as we've seen and we'll see more of? What does our government begin to look like in terms of real life nitty-gritty details? So let's begin. Let's take a look at first the powers of government. In order to understand government at a basic level, you've all been taught that there are basic branches of government. This is simply a review. We have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, and of course we have the judicial branch. This has been a basic understanding since your elementary school days, I'm sure. The legislative branch, in terms of powers, legislate. I'm not trying to use the word in the definition itself, but essentially, as you've learned before, the legislative branch's job is to simply make laws. If we look at the executive branch, the root word of executive is to execute laws. So if the legislative branch has made that, the executive branch is the next in line to make sure that the laws are being carried out. And the judicial branch is there to interpret. This, of course, is probably the most controversial because if it isn't outlined exactly, in our case in the Constitution, it's very difficult to make an understanding of exactly what they meant when our founders wrote our Constitution. But it's a basic understanding, and I have to make sure that everybody knows those three branches of government come from the basic powers of any government. It might be the smallest little government in the world. It might be that government that was created on that deserted island. But there has to be some sort of legislative function, some sort of enforcement function, executive function, and some sort of interpretive function. Now, within that idea of government, we also have to understand that there is a state that develops. And when we talk about a state, we're not necessarily talking about the state of Colorado or the state of Kansas or the state of Wisconsin, my home state, but we're talking about a political state. And I want to make sure we understand the characteristics of the political state, and these are well outlined in the book as well. But if we look at the characteristics of a state, there's 4 of them. Number 1, population. This is pretty simple. There must be people. If you don't have people, you don't have a state. Number 2 is this idea of territory. Territory is simply borders. The state that is created, we know what the borders are. Now this can be a challenge because when we look at this in the context of the current state of the world, one of the newest countries that has been created is the country of South Sudan. South Sudan was created by a vote of its people to break away from the country of Sudan, and because of many years of oppression and violence and things like that, they broke away. They became their own state officially. They had borders, they were recognized, they had a population. This becomes a challenge in places like the region of Kashmir, in Pakistan and India. Perhaps you remember that story from your world history class. But if we look at the issue of the territory of Kashmir, there's border issues. We don't exactly know what that border is. It's not fully agreed upon. And that's a failure of a state when that happens, because they haven't been able to negotiate with their neighbor state to figure out the exact territory. The third characteristic of the state is that there has to be a government. It goes without saying, if you've got population, if you've got land with borders, there has to be some sort of government. Thomas Hobbes, the political philosopher from the Enlightenment that we met in the last lecture, says that government is needed to protect what he calls the war of every man against every man. And that's his idea of human nature, that human beings are going to constantly be in conflict with each other. And a government has to be in place, according to Hobbes, to prevent that natural human nature from taking over and creating some sort of chaos. The fourth characteristic of a state, as outlined in our book, is this idea of sovereignty. And sovereignty is a concept we'll see many, many times in this course, but in terms of a state, sovereignty is basically and simply this government has supreme and absolute power in its territory. So, for example, the United States can't pass a law and say, Canada, we are now going to enforce American law, United States of America's law, in Canada. We don't have sovereign authority over Canada. Just the same, Canada doesn't have sovereign authority over us. So when we look at those four characteristics, you need people, you need a place for those people to live, you need a government to enforce laws within that system, and that government has supreme authority over its people and its people only. Now, once we have this state, the state often has to make a choice in terms of what kind of government are they going to create. When we look at the types of government, we really look at four different types. In America, some falls somewhere in between this Republican direct democracy. We need to understand each of these because they become important pieces of the historical story and the historical record. If we look at direct democracy, perhaps you remember from your world history class, what we're really talking about is this basic idea that comes from Athens. In Athens, that democracy is based on the will of the people. If the majority of people say that this is what they want, direct democracy says that that happens. Direct democracy in Athens is every male citizen that is eligible to vote does vote. That could be thousands of people. They vote on every issue for everything. That's why it's called direct democracy. One of the challenges of the direct democracy is what people call the tyranny of the majority. And the tyranny of the majority is if 51% of the people say that that's what they want, 49% of the people disagree with it, and they have to deal with the fact that that small little difference in percentage is what made the decision. So direct democracy has its challenges. It has its benefits, but it also has its challenges, which we'll talk about in class. If we look at the idea of a republic, what we're really looking at in terms of ancient society is the republic that comes from Rome. The whole idea of a republic is that instead of every single member of society voting, representatives do government or governing. Every citizen doesn't have a vote on everything. Instead, these representatives are elected to be our voice within the government. If we look at this, just these two, perhaps you can see that there are some elements of direct democracy, very few. But when we really look at the story of American government, we're really truly looking at a republic. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. Something you see every once in a while is an oligarchy. Oligarchy, archy in this case meaning power or government. The prefix olig means, very simply, rule by few. It might be a committee, but whatever the case is, it's often an elite group that sits in that power position. If you studied economics or will study economics, you'll hear of a term called an oligopoly. A monopoly is one person controlling everything in economics. An oligopoly is a few firms controlling things. So when we look at government, an oligarchy is a rule by few, often the elite in this society. And then finally we get to autocracy. And there we have the root auto, meaning single, and this is basically a dictatorship with complete control. We've got all kinds of autocracies that we can look at and think about within the context of world history. Most recently, you have a case of Libya, and the autocracy in Libya, ruled by Muammar Gaddafi, was successfully overthrown. Muammar Gaddafi was captured, and Muammar Gaddafi was killed by the rebels in Libya. That's a classic, not classic, but a good example of an autocracy. Now, if we look at this, if we take these four, you can look at them on a continuum of government, where on this part of the spectrum you have the full voice of the people. I know that's a little hard to read, but on the left side you have the full voice of the people, and on the right side of the spectrum you have no voice of the people. So if we put these in their place, by definition, a democracy is the full voice of the people. Somewhere here. Right here, you might have the republic. This idea being that there are people that you have a voice in electing your representatives, and the representatives go and do the work of government. Over here, we would have the oligarchy, and then of course over here, we would have the autocracy. So when we look at this in terms of a continuum, if we're looking at this pretty specifically, change my pen color here for you. If we're looking at this pretty specifically, perhaps the United States falls somewhere right there. Somewhat a democracy, somewhat a republic at the same time. Now, once that government's created, we've got that in place, we have these foundational concepts, there's a choice. We have three systems that we can pick up. It all has to do with how is power distributed. We've got our government system, now we have to figure out how our power is distributed. In a unitary system, all power is held by one agency. In this case, let's call it the Parliament. In England, there is no president. There is a Parliament. There is a leader that is elected out of Parliament from the ruling party, but it's a representative body. The government is one agency. In this case, in England, it's a great example. England is herself a parliament. The power is derived from the people, and that government serves those people. Unitary system meaning one. In this case, the parliament is the single unit of power in the government. Now we have what we have in the United States, which is known as a federal system. On one side of the equation, you have the national government. On the other side of the equation, you have the state government. And the national government has authority over the people, just the same as the state government has authority over the people. Just different kinds of authority. State government, let's say, might deal with education. National government might deal with immigration, although of course controversial today. The key part of this story is the fact that while one group deals with one thing and the other group deals with the other, there is a sharing of power between the national and state governments. And that is the definition of a federal system. When we say our government is a federal system of government, it means that the national government shares some power with the state government. This is designed to make sure that the government doesn't get out of control. A unitary system, like we see here, might have a quite powerful single unit of government that gets out of control. In our system of government, maybe you have a little bit of a check and balance, and that's what the federal structure was set up to do. This actually comes from an idea out of Baron de Montesquieu's work. Sharing of powers, divided government is much better in terms of functioning. The last one that we'll look at here is what's called the Confederate system. Now, in terms of history, think of the Articles of Confederation. This was our first government, and essentially the states had all of the power, and the national government had very little. This is important because, of course, we know that the Articles of Confederation didn't exist for very long. We had our own Constitutional Convention, which created a new system of government because the Confederate system wasn't working. Here's how the Confederate system works. The state government has its authority derived from its people, and they exist in their own little power vacuums. They have their powers. State A has its powers, State B has its powers, State C has its powers. But then we have the national government that kind of floats out here. In the Confederate system, the states are sovereign. They hold most, if not all, of the power. And what they do is they just simply give a little bit of that power to the national government. States like this. It's local control. In U.S. history, we called it states' rights. We called it home rule. We called it any number of different things. Popular sovereignty. The idea is the national government is weak, while the state governments are strong. That was what happened with the Articles of Confederation. National government wasn't strong enough to do its job. And so when they gathered together at the Constitutional Convention in the late 18th century, they realized they had a problem they had to fix. And the problem was this strong state government and very weak national government that couldn't respond when it needed to respond to things. All of these things, when we look at this, the powers of government, the characteristics of the state, the functions that are outlined in the preamble that we looked at already, the philosophy of government and social contract theory, the types of government there are, and distribution of power, these are all the building blocks that we have to understand before we can begin to analyze our system of government. This ends the second lecture. Please make sure that you've got this information in your notes, and if there are holes in your notes, please go to the book to refer to that in Chapter 1. We'll talk briefly about some of these things in class, but what I'd like you to think about as you finish this lecture and prepare for class is our federal system of government, where we share power between states and national government, like we see here, is that effective? What are its challenges? In what ways can the national government come in conflict with the state government? And who wins out? That's the key question that we'll begin to look at next time we see each other. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, whatever it is.